to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Today we have Richard Suttles again, the Faithiest Atheist. And today we were planning to discuss morality. And shortly before the show started, Richard was telling me a little bit about the work he does. So why don't you tell the audience about your work?
Okay, yeah, sure. And while I'm talking, keep in mind I'm in my house, and so you might hear my wife, my kids, my dog, the neighbors. You might hear all sorts of normal house sounds, and so I apologize in advance for that. But I work in the counterterrorism world, and that part's not super secret. And I especially focus on radicalization. And radicalization isn't always a bad word. Sometimes radicalization is just focused. If you can be really radicalized, you can be really focused on something, and that doesn't necessarily lead to anything bad. Sometimes it can be wonderful things. But the people who get on the radar, the people who kill innocent people and brag about it and want to do it, that's what we focus on. So I call it radicalization towards dehumanization, where you get radicalized to the point where you see other people as not human. You start to talk about them as viruses or just things that need to be wiped away, but just not people. That's what I focus on. And I've been doing that since 1995. I no longer know how many years that is. For a long time, I would talk about how many years that was, but now it's just a different century, and I've been doing it forever. And because of that, I got into this, especially got into this theism, atheism stuff, because I could see a lot of people getting into that kind of mindset where they get radicalized towards dehumanizing others. And it made me really want to get into the game and try to pull people back from those ledges, more so than trying to convince people of atheism. I'm far more interested in watching both theists and atheists go from angry, for those who are, certainly not everybody is like this, but for the theists and atheists who are so angry that they just want to wipe each other off the map, I like to watch some of them get a little bit more calm and accepting about how people with different worldviews exist, and not to necessarily assume that they're viruses that need to be wiped away. That's really been why I got into this. So yeah, I was just telling you, John, that that's my work. That's what I do.
It's fascinating and very necessary in today's world. We've all seen the images of the guys being paraded in the orange jumpsuits out on the beach and beheaded
Right.
in the name of a religion. And I recently had a conversation, I don't recall with who, but we were talking about the God hates fags people on
Right.
the Christian side. Hate is not compatible with a theological worldview, in my opinion, regardless of the religion.
I like to hear that kind of language. That's the kind of stuff I chase after.
We're on the same page, brother.
Good.
But let's talk about morality today.
Okay.
What is your thought on morality in general?
So I always hear the word like naturalist and materialist thrown around, and I hesitate to say that because I don't know what all is included with nature. We're really good at like quantum particles and forces and physical laws, and we're really good at figuring out a whole bunch about reality in our cosmos and things from the microscopic to the grand cosmic scales. But I don't know that I can only use that material to describe every mystery that we have left. I don't know that anybody can do that. But then again, I don't know that means there has to be something outside of the natural world. I just think that there could be other natural things that we haven't learned about yet. But my take for morality is that it is something that's biological, where living creatures will have choices to make, and even when we get into choices and decision making, that's an interesting topic as well. But they have options that they could take, and they'll see some as a priority or more meaningful or more correct than other ones. And a big thing for morality with humans is that once we decide or once we discover, whether it's the decision or discover, however you want to see it, what we think is right and wrong. For some things, we think that should be applicable to everybody else for all other times. So we're like, hey, 10,000 years ago, you should have been doing this too. And 10,000 years from now, they should be doing this too. And so we see this absolute right and wrong. I've heard people say that it's relative and there are no objective morals, but then if you push it, they get angry. People who say they don't exist, you start prodding them a little bit, they get angry. So I think even that they see as something that's absolute. And
Well,
so
I try not to get angry, but I do like to have clear definitions of things.
people who say that there are no absolute morals, if you prod them on that, they start to get angry, which makes me think that your fact that you're getting angry means that you probably do think that there is some absolute moral.
And then the question automatically becomes, if there are universal or objective morals, from where do they come?
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure that's what, especially for your side, that's the kind of stuff we'll talk about or get into. As for me, I don't know if there are, and if there are, I don't know how they got there, but I am skeptical to see it as a creator providing them for us and that we can discover them if we really look into it, that we'll all discover the same things. That makes me, I doubt that's what's going on.
First, I think that it's important that we do come to some common agreement, or at least to make an attempt to get to common agreement on terminology.
Okay.
And so I prefer the terms objective morality and either subjective morality or relative morality, depending on which you prefer. But there's two different kinds of morality. There's a morality where I have a certain set of values and you have a certain set of values, and they may or may not be compatible. That is relative morality.
Right.
And subjective morality, it depends on the person or the individual. And then there's objective morality, which is murder is always wrong. There's not any gray area there. It's always wrong because God has himself forbidden us to murder each other. God has forbidden us to commit adultery. That's not something that people adhere to anymore. But the fact is that just because people no longer adhere to objectively moral values does not mean that objective morality does not exist. And
Right.
my argument for that would be going back in time just briefly back to the Hitler days and Stalin days, because that's a very important time to note what the difference is in relative morality. It's important to remember that in Germany, it was legal to do what Hitler was doing because he controlled the government. He's the one that set the rules, and then he played by the rules that he set. So if we could argue that if Germany had won the war, from a humankind standpoint, Hitler won. And in that same light, Stalin did win because Stalin murdered 3 times as many people as Hitler, didn't get the notoriety that Hitler did, and he died of natural causes. In a humanistic world, Stalin never received any sort of justice, anything resembling justice for his actions. In a theological worldview, Stalin is now reaping the rewards of or the punishment for his actions now, even though he's dead. And you could argue that you're making up a fantasy story to punish people like Stalin that escape justice in this world. But then I look at some of the other people that I've interviewed on this podcast, like most importantly, Matthew Botsford, who's been shot in the back of the head as an innocent bystander in a drive-by shooting. And he claims that when he died, and he did medically die, according to the doctors, they wanted to harvest his organs. But when he died, he claims he went to hell, even though he wasn't guilty of things in the sense that Stalin or Hitler were guilty of. He was the innocent bystander minding his own business, but he claims when he died that he went to hell. And my attitude toward all this is I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. I tend to take them at their word. And the fact that he's able to string together a coherent sentence to me is in and of itself a medical miracle. There's no argument. I've held the MRI in my hand showing the bullet still embedded in the guy's head. So there's no question that the injuries are very real. The only question is his story real? And I have no reason to doubt him, but then there's your perspective. What do you think of a final judgment in terms of morality?
I doubt that there's something like that where if you do the right things, you go to heaven, and if you don't, you go to hell. I think that's something that we invent, but not necessarily consciously. But I also don't know that if you die, that there's no way to have any type of experience or any kind of memories if you come back. I don't know that it can't be that way. That once your brain stops working, then you can't come back and report any experiences, because that does happen. What worries me about afterlife experiences is that I do what you do. I take people at their word. And so when someone comes back and says, I went and I did meet Allah, and I suddenly understood Arabic, and I did finally understand that Islam is the one true way, I take him seriously, and it changes his life, and he can't wait to talk more about it. I take him at his word. And so I think there's something about reality where people can have some kind of experiences, and then they come back and report them. And maybe it includes content that they were exposed to in their life, and maybe because it's true, maybe because there's something else that's going on. I don't know. But one thing I know for sure is that if everyone who passed away all came back and said, there is a creator, his name is Bob, he has these 3 sentences that he always says, and if every single person came back with that same experience, then I would be like, that's reality. That's something that's going to happen to anybody after they die. But that's not what happens. People have different, conflicting, highly important, meaningful experiences, but not the same experience, which makes me wonder, is that something that's part of what's going on with us rather than some existing dimension that we tap into after we die?
This is the part of the interview that always gets dicey because we reach a point where we're talking about something that's not exactly the topic we started on.
Right.
But I'm very interested in this subject, which is the near-death experience. And
Right.
I have to at least go a little bit further to
Okay.
find out, because I get a lot of information and recognize that it's slanted to some degree, at least, to present a point of view that's compatible with mine.
Right.
And but my attitude is, when I look into research of the near death experience, I don't just look for versions or accounts that conform to my existing worldview. I
Right.
look for accounts that are from Muslims. I look for accounts that are
Good.
from people in other religions. I look for accounts that have what's called corroborated veridical evidence in support of them, where memories while they're in this incapacitated state,
Right.
and it's remarkable some of the things that they're happening. So it makes me firm in the conviction that there's something beyond this life. But you made a specific reference to someone who apparently was not a Muslim, who had a near-death experience and claimed to see Allah. Is that an actual account, or is that just
Right.
an example anecdote? Or
Right. No, there is someone that I know that had that experience, but who had heard of Islam and had looked into it. And again, this is according to him after the event, that he was a Christian and had heard of Islam and had looked into it and had dismissed it, and then had this experience and saying, I didn't know Arabic. But then when Jesus was screaming at me in Arabic, then I suddenly realized I did know Arabic. And Jesus was screaming at me that I had called him a God when I knew full well that he was only a prophet, and I was blaspheming him and God when I tried to say that he was part of a Trinity, and I knew Trinity was wrong. And all these things suddenly came to me, and they came to me in Arabic. That's his story. And I take him at his word. That's his meaningful experience. Did he come up with some of that later? I don't know. But the thing is what do I make of somebody whose life has changed, who has these reports and saying he didn't know Arabic and suddenly did? And I didn't ask him. I didn't say, okay, tell me something in Arabic now. But even if I did, apparently this had been years ago. Maybe he's learned Arabic since then. I don't know. But my thing is, if someone says things like that, I'm like, man, especially if it changes their life. If their life improves, then I'm like, man, I'm just so glad you had that experience. I'm not the kind of guy
this
that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Did his life improve? Because you're talking about this person, and it sounds like it may have come across your radar in your capacity in some form. And
No, this was just a normal conversation with people. I've had conversations like you and I have now for 40 years. People telling me how their lives change and things like that. It wasn't somebody that was preaching violence. This was, although we do run across manifestos and stuff from people who say that they have these experiences, but instead of feeling connected to all people, like some people will have an experience, even atheists will report this experience, that they'll have this enlightening experience where they feel connected to all people. Some people will come back saying they've got connected to this ideal or to this concept. And in that case, it's like I'm at one with this concept that I'm now forced to teach everyone else about how this concept is sacred and how it's worth our individual well-being pales in comparison to this concept. And if you don't agree, then there's something morally and intellectually wrong with you, and I'm going to correct you until you understand it. And then if that doesn't work, then we're going to take more strenuous measures because it's just that important for this concept to endure. That's the kind of stuff that we run across at work. But this one guy that I'm talking about is just an Islamic apologist and was telling me how he knows Islam is true and how philosophy and reason and logic and scripture and all of reality and math all proves what he says. I've run into a lot of really smart people from different religions who say that all of the philosophy and logic and reason and scripture and everything backs up what they say. And rather than say that they've got it all wrong, I just recognize that's part of humanity. I think we all are in the worldview building business, and a lot of people don't think about it. A lot of people say, hey, my worldview is I'm just going to get through the day, leave me alone. In fact, most people probably have that worldview. But some people say, no, I'm going to kick the tires and I'm going to do my research and I'm going to come away with the truth. But out of those people, you're going to get some Mormons, some Muslims, some Christians, some atheists, some Hindus, some Buddhists. And if they keep going in that direction, pretty soon they're going to have pretty much every angle that you can come at them. They're going to be able to swiftly move it away and defend what they believe. And I just think there's something about us that can get us to that point, more so than to think that any one of those warriors have it all correct. And maybe one of them does. I'm not one to say that there is no truth, just that there's something about humans where you can get those super intellectual warriors who can defend their worldview from any angle. And even though it doesn't match the guy next to them, they're probably going to go to their grave with that certainty. There's just something about reality that leads us to that. And I don't know what it is.
my take on the near-death experience is that they're basically anecdotes, they're stories, and most of them have little, if any, informative value. They're pleasant to hear, they're reassuring in some sense, but they're confirming an existing worldview. They're not presenting new information, with the exceptions of the corroborated veridical accounts. Those I do find interesting, but mostly I look at the individual stories as, most of the time they're talking about going to heaven, whether it's Jews or Christians or whatever religion. They're talking about going to a paradise. I'm probably more interested in the accounts where they talk about going to hell, because I want to understand, why do people have different experiences. I'm trying to get a more analytical approach to the data as a whole. And the other aspect of it is that, shoot, lost my train of thought there for a second. It was about the people in the University of Virginia and the research that they are doing, but the actual point I was going to make, I lost that. So maybe we'll come back to it. Let's go on and get back to morality.
Okay.
Because that's an interesting subject in and of itself. And society has rules. We turn certain morals into laws because we feel that strongly about them. And then other morals, sometimes they are laws, like the adultery laws were back when we were really young people. But now society has conformed to say that adultery isn't a criminal act. It may not be a moral act, but it's not a crime. How do we come to some sort of universal agreement on whether something's always right or always wrong.
Yeah, I think that's going to be something that humans are going to agonize over as long as we're on Earth, because we are in different points in the globe in different points of time, and there's going to be different things that really get us riled up. But I will say that when people consider morality, and this goes back to what you're saying for objective or subjective, I still say that even atheists and even people who say that there is no such thing as objective morality, I still say that everybody perceives a priority of morals. So that if someone says, hey, I don't think it's important to read a book, I don't like books, then people like you and me would be like, oh, okay. Although we think reading books is important and maybe even morally important, we probably won't get freaked out. But if we meet someone who says, hey, I like to go buy baby kittens so that I can kill them just to watch them die, then you and I are going to be like, I'm calling the cops. I might arrest you right now. I might tackle you right now and put you in the trunk of my car for saying that, because some things are priorities for us. And so we do perceive those priorities. And so for some reason, some priorities change. And some cultures, adultery was huge. And some cultures saying the name of a God wrong was huge. Here you can have your neighbor can walk outside and worship a palm tree. And the neighbors will be like, that's weird, but they won't go attack him. So those priorities change for whatever reasons, cultural reasons, biological reasons. I don't know why, but I think we should at least agree that we all perceive a priority, and then we can why. Why do we perceive a priority? Is it because there is actually a priority that exists outside of us, or is there something going on within that leads to that? And I don't know. I study a lot about natural because of my job, because I work in the counterterrorism world, and because my academic pursuit and my professional career is on the cognition that goes in people's minds. Almost all these books behind me are about the cognition and the natural development of morality. And I don't know that any scientist has been able to say this is exactly how morality down to the neuron. There is a lot of information out there about how morality might evolve naturally, but I don't think that anybody's solved it to make it so that they can describe morality in the same way they can describe lightning. If it is natural, then it's exactly like lightning. There's a piece by piece explanation as to why it's like that. But I don't think any scientists have gotten anywhere near to how we can describe lightning with to be able to do that with morality. I think atheists and people who don't believe in objective morality should at least concede that right now that's a gap on our side. I think that's what's going on, but I don't claim to be able to explain it, or that any scientist can explain it in the same way we can describe lightning.
This conversation reminds me of the joke that goes, let's eat, Grandma, or let's eat, Grandma. It's a difference in punctuation. A comma makes all the difference, but we inherently understand that the invitation to come to dinner is a vastly different thing to say than let's consume our family member. Cannibalism. And it's a horrifying joke, but we know from examples in the real world that people do actually eat other people, most recently and notably Jeffrey Dahmer. And it becomes a really interesting conversation that transcends both sides of the spectrum, because if you aren't aware of this, Dahmer, once he was in prison, claimed to have a Christian conversion experience and said that he gave a pretty famous interview where he blamed a lot of what he believed on atheistic worldviews and evolutionary teachings and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is, according to atheists, he should be in hell regardless. If hell existed, he should be in hell regardless because of what he did while he was on earth. And the
Right,
Christians,
a lot of people are horrified by what he did of any worldview. That's right.
most reasonable and sane human being, are horrified by
Mhm.
what he did. The question is, what were his crimes irredeemable? And if there's a very popular atheist joke where Jesus is comforting this little kid who's saying, look over there, little Timmy, there's the person that murdered your family and raped your mother and all this horrible stuff, but he begged for forgiveness, so he's in heaven now. and you get to be with
I've
him
seen
for eternity. And it's a very childish attempt to insult the Christian worldview. But the Christian worldview does say that there are no unforgivable sins except for blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, which nobody really seems to be able to define very well. But that's another point. The fact is that according to human judgment, human morality, human worldviews, Dahmer should not be forgiven.
some things seem so bad that we can't imagine them being okay afterwards. It's alluring to think that somebody who goes that far would ever be comfortable again. It's more comfortable to think, it's more comfortable for us to think that person's just always agonizing for what they did.
But then when you watch the movie The Passion of the Christ, there's nothing.
I saw that, and I saw Last Temptation of Christ.
Ah, you got both sides of the coin there, didn't you? Defoe's a very good actor. I tended to prefer The Passion. I tended to think it stuck a little closer to Scripture.
Yeah, Last Temptation was more like one guy's.
It's a fantasy. It's like an acid trip.
Yeah.
But anyway, getting back on point with Dahmer, there is that human sense that there are things that should not be forgiven.
Right.
But then there is supernatural wisdom that we see in the Bible. And if the story of the Passion is true, and I believe it is, then there is no punishment worse than what Jesus took on the cross. So, how can we say in our human understanding that something is always wrong? That Dahmer should suffer in hell? Technically speaking, Hitler could have had a deathbed conversion. It's very unlikely. And but people don't like to consider the possibility. But if you believe what the religion says, if you believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, if somebody does confess that, there's the parable of the people that go in the field and work all day, and then the people that show up at the end, and the people that show up at the end get the same reward basically as the people that were working all day. And nobody understands that parable. But I think in this context, in the morality context, it begins to make a little bit of sense that the rules are not set by the employees. The rules are set by the employer. God is the creator, and we are his, I don't want to say entities, but we are the objects of his creation. And we're questioning the wisdom of God when we're starting to say, this person should not be in heaven, or that person should be in hell. Again, assuming that we believe that these two extremes exist. But if they don't exist, then there are no consequences. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. But I do understand that if there's another set of consequences after we die, then that changes the game. If there's not, then we are stuck with whatever happens here on Earth. I suspect we're stuck with what happens here on Earth. It's alluring to think that people who do the wrong things get away with it, and then they die, and then they pay for it. And it's alluring to think that somebody who gets victimized and they're just a good person and they just endure it and then they die. It's great to think that they're rewarded later, but I don't know that ever happens. And I think that if we don't create our own systems here for controlling behavior, and I say controlling behavior like Borg or something, or at least having standards and systems for behavior, if we don't do that, we're not going to do well. I like to compare us to ants. If you don't have standards for the colony, then the colony is not going to do well. And now, if you look at ant rights within the colony, it's not great. A female ant can have babies who's not the queen. Everybody stops what they're doing and goes and kills the babies. And sometimes she helps because that's not who's supposed to have the babies. The queen's supposed to have the babies. Now, however, if ant colonies that don't do that are going to have problems. They're going to have division problems. You got to have some sort of standards for your society in order to flourish. Hopefully, your standards are less fierce than only a queen can have babies. We're not like ants in that respect, but you should have some sort of standards for your society. A good study on this is there's a scientist, and she's passed away now. Her name is Eleanor Ostrom, and she discovered something called core principles, and it had to do with the tragedy of the commons. Have you ever heard of tragedy of the commons?
No, I haven't.
So with tragedy of the commons, it has to do with a landscape that has multiple cultures, and they're all using the same resources. So like a river with the water, or fields that they can use to plant stuff. There's an area where the different cultures can use those same resources. And she studied different times and places all around the world for decades, and found out that the ones who had done the best over the longest amount of time, they had agreed upon rules between the cultures about how each person had to invest so much, but also allow other people to make decisions. So people had different buy-ins. But there's 8 or 9 core principles that each of these cultures all around the world all agreed on, and they did well when it came to managing these resources. Because if the cultures had started killing each other over the resources, then they might have died. They might have all died. Or if they had started destroying the resources so that other people couldn't have them, then the resources will be gone. But if they agreed on how to use it fairly and how to deal with challenges and problems within the groups and between the groups, if they agreed on these 8 core principles, like a United Nations, but for this only particular area, then they did well. And they had pretty much the same core principles. And was it because there's like a deity outside of them that gave it to them and then they discovered it? Or was it through trial and error? And from her research, it looked like they had discovered it. So 2 things were interesting. One was that it looked like they had discovered it through trial and error, through just trying different things and realizing. And then the survivors of that are like, that does not work. We're not doing that. And we're going to do this. Okay, that's just way too great. We're not doing that anymore. And so the survivors are left with these principles that work, having tried everything else. However, if you ask the cultures how it happened, they would say, oh, the great volcano told us, or oh, the amazing sun god told us. So their stories was that it was revealed from above, but the truth was that they had found it through trial and error. And if it had been revealed from above, they certainly went through the motions of trial and error over generations to get to those 8 core principles. So I suspect that a lot of our moral systems are based on trial and error. I imagine that a lot of religious people think about what happened. A lot of Christians think about what happened during the Reformation War and how people from both sides were going house to house in villages and hunting down people who believed in the wrong version of Christianity. And that the survivors of that said, we are never doing that again. We're never doing that again. And the people who were going house to house were looking at verses and saying, this is why we need to go house to house. But generations later, people are like, I don't care what anything says or how anybody interprets it. We're never doing that again. And so I think that there is some trial and error that goes on, even with Christians, where you come to these conclusions and say, this is our guiding force. Maybe because God revealed it, but maybe because other people had to go through it before people realized that is a priority in morality. And so I think that's how morality works more than it's being revealed from above.
One of the reasons I find the concept of objective morality appealing is the alternative is that humans are the most advanced moral agents in the universe if there is no God. And what we've seen and learned throughout history is that humans are not the wisest agents to have acting.
True.
And one of the examples I like to give is from my book, The Wolves of Yellowstone. The humans decided that the wolves were the apex predators and that they needed to be gotten rid of because they were killing cattle and they were causing
Right.
too many problems. So they got rid of all the wolves. And what happened was there was a degradation of the entire ecology of Yellowstone Park over time, where the rivers became less fixed and they meandered more, and there was overpopulations of certain species, and there were no populations at all to speak of other species. And then a small pack of wolves was reintroduced into the park, and what they saw was that everything changed. It wasn't just that there were now the apex predators at the top of the food chain. The food chain came back, the entire food chain. It's one of the most remarkable videos I think on the internet is to
I've heard of
watch.
that. I've heard of that story. Yeah.
If you look in the book, if there's a link to a little 5-minute video where they show this in a little miniature documentary, and it's really an amazing thing to see. And my point is, humans are the worst judges imaginable. We're terrible at it.
I agree with that. We're not good. In fact, I think that's a lot of what Christianity is, a realization that sometimes, even if we think we know what to do, we still sometimes can't do it. So I think, just like I was saying, every human can perceive some priority morals that sort of seem objective and seem applicable to everybody. Just so I think we all realize that there's a sense of goodness, kind of like what C.S. Lewis was talking about, like a sense of goodness that we can't seem to achieve. So yeah, I agree with that too. I think humans agree that and then have trouble achieving it as well.
That's one of the things I like about you is you're able to quote C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, he was a smart dude.
He was indeed. But one of the arguments coming from the atheist perspective against Christians is the no true Scotsman fallacy, where anytime a Christian says did such and such of a horrible thing, they're not really a Christian because they didn't believe in the teachings of Jesus as taught in the Bible. And I think that there is an element of truth to that, but it's also being used as an excuse. The reality is there are no true Christians in the sense of nobody can be like the Jesus in the Bible. We just all fall short of that standard. And the guy that comes to mind when I think about this issue is Dennis Rader. And if you aren't familiar with that name, he was the BTK killer.
Okay, yeah.
Bind, torture, and kill. And they caught the guy because he was he was the president of his congregation. He was actually a Lutheran, which was the religion I was raised in. And he was the president of his congregation. And they caught him because he was using the church computer to write these letters taunting the police, ridiculing them and mocking them. And the police had the last laugh because there was cryptics inside of the Word document that the guy sent that identified that it came from that church, and they were ultimately able to come back and identify him through the letter that he wrote.
Wow.
And my take on that is no person that calls himself a Christian could be tempted to bind, torture, and kill. That person was basically being a charlatan. But by the same token, he was the president of the congregation. He was able to pass himself off as having Christian morals and standards. So how can we as individuals judge someone else? You can't based on their external appearance or their external actions. You have to be able to look inside of them, which only God can do. So I don't really know where I'm going with this point other than to talk about what a horrible person Dennis Rader was and how offensive to my sensibilities the fact is that someone who could claim to be a Christian could do something for pleasure, sadistic pleasure. He didn't know his victims, and he murdered whole families. He was one of the sickest people on the earth, but he also had a family. He has children that thought he loved them, and maybe in some way he did. But to me, it's difficult for me to fathom that anybody could look at another human being and want to kill them. I'm the type of person that if I find a moth in the house, I try to catch it and carry it outside and let it go. I don't just automatically kill them. It's only when I get frustrated and can't catch them that I kill them by accident usually.
I think I'm like that except for scorpions.
Yeah, they have no redeeming value.
I was just going to say one thing that I study about neurology, which kind of surprised me, was that our brain really looks for patterns. And it's, oh, your dogs are bigger than mine. My dogs.
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I wish mine would run up here so you could see her. She could fit in my hand.
Well, that's the Great Pyrenees in the background. He's shaking the walls. And I
Yeah.
thought I left the back door open so he could go outside and bark, but
Yeah.
apparently. Can I pause this just for a second?
Sure,
And
sure.
yeah, let me see if I can figure out how to pause it.
Okay.
All right, I'll be right back.
Now, according to the video, it still says live. But I'm wondering if it's still recording. If it is, this will just be more interesting for the show.
Okay. I don't think I did that. I think I stopped the camera and left the audio rolling. And
Yeah,
the idiot was barking at
Yeah.
the front windows, and the back door was wide open. He could have gone outside the whole time. So.
Yeah, I think it kept recording. So I said something like, if this is still recording, this will just be more interesting for the show. We can edit it out.
Oh, no, I'll leave it. I'll
Okay.
leave it.
Yeah, so our brains are really good at looking for patterns. And another interesting thing is that some people become alcoholics when they weren't born into it or they didn't inherit it from anybody, but it became a habit for them to get alcohol. And over the years, their brain just said, okay, this is who I am. And their non-conscious brain would just push to make sure you had your evening drinks and then have maybe an afternoon drink and then maybe have a morning drink. So I think sometimes when people do horrible things, I think they try something and then they say, oh, I'm going to do that again. And it becomes a pattern. And people like the BTK, it became part of who he was. And their brain was like, okay, yeah, we're going to do this. And then he was able to he could go back home and then take care of his kids and go to church and do his stuff. So I think that's just a weird thing about brains, which again makes me think that maybe nobody's watching, that maybe our brains are just weird. And sometimes we can do inspiring things, but sometimes we can do devastating things.
There are varying degrees of insanity or evil. It kind of depends. There's the famous guy, I don't remember how to pronounce his last name. It's Gain or Gein, Ed Gain, I think,
Okay.
Gein.
That sounds familiar.
He's the guy that inspired the movie Silence of the Lambs.
Okay.
He murdered several people and then skinned them and made ornaments and clothing out of their skin after he killed them. But there was no fooling anybody with Ed Gain. As soon as the police went out there and saw him and talked to him, they knew he was insane. The police actually caught Jeffrey Dahmer with one of his victims who had escaped, and the police let Dahmer take the victim back to his apartment and kill him afterwards because Dahmer was able to pass himself off to the police as a rational guy who just happened to be gay.
Wow. I didn't know that part.
Yeah. It's very disturbing how complacency in society can lead to great evil going undiscovered because people just are bad at their jobs.
Yep. One day we might even do a show about how technology is creeping into that oversight, and then what kind of society will we be? Because I think in time we'll be at the point where we can't lie about where we are ever. From 24/7, wherever you are, the whole world's going to know it. So you can't tell your wife like, oh yeah, I had to work late. She's going to be like, nope, you went to the liquor store or you went to the casino. And it might not happen to mine and your generation, but I think in a couple of generations, and I've even told my kids who are teenagers now, I'm like, get ready to live in a world where wherever you are, everybody's going to know it, and there's not going to be any talking around it. So you might as well be responsible and be respectful, because pretty soon everybody's going to know where you are 24/7. I think that's coming, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think it's coming.
Hey, for research, so in addition to writing the nonfiction books, I also write detective novels. So one of the things I like to do is I do a lot of research watching these true crime shows, and I've already learned we're already there, my friend. If you commit a crime, leave your cell phone at home.
Right.
Because it's tracking everywhere that you go. It gives the police a roadmap to where you hid the body. And they just go out there and dig it up.
I think the cell phones are one thing, but I think pretty soon there'll be smart cams and smart devices.
Oh, they're already there. It's very rare that you can get away with anything in this modern world scot-free. No,
I'm actually okay with that. I think it might be good for us to have that.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, unless there's somebody. I think the trick to this is that everybody has to have it on everybody. Because if there's some watcher that isn't that way, then that watcher might be able to exploit people.
It gives people too much power if they can control the narrative that you see in the video. That was the January 6th videos.
Yeah.
There was a narrative that there was all of this horrific violence and there was an insurrection. And then they started to release all of the videos, and they said there was a lot of just people walking through the Capitol building.
Right.
There was violence on January 6th, but it wasn't all violence. And it was two different perspectives being put forth, depending
Right.
on who controlled release of the videos.
That was one thing whenever I talk about this, and I talk about this a lot, is as I say that a lot of it has to do with what happened on January 6th, because if you watched one set of channels, it was all violence all the time. And if you watch another set of channels, it was all peaceful and everyone was wonderful. And it was really hard to find somebody to say, no, there was both. And I found Ben Shapiro would do that. Ben Shapiro would say a whole bunch of people went there and minded their own business and went home. And then some people went in there and they did some horrible things and they deserved jail time. And he was one of the few celebrities that would take both sides. Now, he's mostly conservative and he's almost always on a conservative channel, but he'll admit both of those things happen. But it's really difficult for a celebrity podcaster or major news network to admit that both happened.
Everybody has an agenda.
Yep. And so I really like people who say, okay, I tend to lean this way, but I'll admit that this all happened. In fact, that's the whole thing behind Faithiest Atheist, was I tried to have my feet in both camps so that I can say, okay, yeah, there's times when atheists are embarrassing and there's times when Christians are inspiring. So I try to give.
And the reverse is true.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I know where we might be heading up on an hour. Do you cut these off in an hour or no?
I don't cut them off. They just come to their own end.
Yep.
When we have exhausted talking about the subject and I start staring at you blankly, that's usually when I say, it's been a good show. Quite frankly, in the book, I think I only managed to come up with 4 or 5 pages about morality, and I already dropped the big reveal of talking about Dennis Rader.
Right.
And there is no clear solution to the problem of morality,
Right.
unless you allow that there is universal wrongs, that murder is always wrong, that cannibalism is always wrong. There are things that. Go ahead.
I think we should do that. I think we should teach ideas. And as I'm a non-believer, my wife's a Christian, and our kids are one of each right now. But we teach them the same rules. We're like, it's not like this changes how we see what's right and wrong. There are still things that you should never do. And then there are behaviors that you can do that it's going to make your life easier. So I would say push these things that you're talking about that you just never work out well. And then push like these common core principles that I was talking about earlier with Eleanor Ostrom, about how you should interact with how to act within people within your own culture and how to treat people in different cultures. These are behaviors that have worked over time. And then you can say, did God tell us this, or did we discover it through trial and error? These are great questions to go over, but meanwhile, do them. And while you're wondering how they came to be, do them. And if we're all doing them, then we're allowed to keep talking about whether God gave them to us or whether we figured it out through trial and error. But just my thing, my ministry, my preaching is do it. So I think it's good to treat these rules as if they are universal, even if they didn't come from an external, which they might have, but even if they didn't, treat them that way anyway.
That's great advice.
Thank you. It's like Jordan Peterson saying, living as if God exists. So live as if these rules are actual bestowed upon us rules.
You quote a lot of great sources. Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro. I don't agree with everything that anybody says, but I tend to agree with more of what they say than what they don't, than I disagree.
I was raised conservative, and back in the 80s, that didn't really mean religious. It just meant that there were traditions and systems that kind of kept society going. And I still believe that. I think that there have been, especially in the Republican Party, in fact, there's a lot of conservatives who just don't play anymore because it's gotten to be too much about religion. But in fact, a lot of people, if you say Republican, they'll just assume you mean Christian. But I was raised under those conservative, kind of like Thomas Sowell. I was raised like under those kind of principles, and they still hold true for me today. So I listen to a lot of conservatives now too.
So you would not be supportive of biological males competing as females in
Right.
sport.
And honestly, I think that should just be universal. Every so often, there's the left and the right get into something, and I'm like, this should be something where the other side just immediately says, "Okay, that's bad."
To me, there's a common sense approach. And
Yeah.
the common sense approach is that you say, okay, if you are a biological male or a biological female and you identify as the other sex, the other gender, and we'll have a special bathroom. Just
Yes.
there's a parents' changing bathroom, there's a female locker room, there's a male locker room, and then there's a locker room for special accommodations kind of thing.
100%. I'm 100% on board with that.
But what we have now is we have fully intact biological males jumping in the shower with 14 and 15-year-old girls. And the school administrators are telling the girls that they have to accept this or they will suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
And to me,
I would tell my kids, so I've got 2 teenage girls, and if they run into something like that, I'd tell them, you have my permission to leave. And if you get in trouble with the school, then we'll get you a better school.
you're a good dad.
And I also, even though my kids go to public schools, we're in a rural Arizona town. We're as Christian, or even though it's mostly Mormon, we're as Christian oriented as you can imagine. We take the Friday off before Easter, and we're not allowed to say that. So they say admin day, but that admin day is always the Friday before Easter every single year. So it's a very Christian oriented town, even though the public school, it's still a Christian school.
Well, it's good for you that you, being an atheist, you don't object to that. And you recognize it for what it is. It's a celebration of Good Friday that they're passing off as an admin day under the excuse. But there's a lot of people that they would say, oh, no, we're going to make a big stink out of it because I'm an atheist and that's separation of church and state and all that good nonsense. And you have a much more pragmatic approach to it. And that's one of the reasons why I like you so much. And I've already invited you back for your second visit to the podcast. And I'm seriously starting to thinking about, you mentioned having other visits, and I'm starting to think, well, maybe we just need to make you a permanent addition.
Let's do it. Especially if there's like one thing I'm really good at, although sometimes I make it worse, is if there's an atheist and a Christian who disagree on something. Sometimes they'll come and ask me and they'll say, where do you fall? Because they know I have feet in both camps. But sometimes I'll make them both mad when I do that. But sometimes I can find some common ground there that kind of takes the bite away from the anger.
I promise I won't get mad, or at least I won't get mad easily. And I mean, you have a very, like I said already, a pragmatic approach to the problem.
Right.
And I value your input.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really like watching your show too. I like your podcast and I like your Facebook page.
Yeah, it gets a little nutty there sometimes.
And so far, I like your book. So with your book, you gave me the audio version, and I've skipped forward because you can go chapter to chapter. And I've skipped forward to different parts. So I still want to go from front to back on it. But you're a very good writer. And honestly, you could have been the audiobook guy. You didn't need to get that other guy because your voice is, I think you got that Southern voice that really works well with your book, probably more so than the narrator that you have on it, or the publisher. I'm sure your publisher picked him. But
no, actually, I did pick him. And I, like every other writer, I hate the sound of my own voice.
I see.
And so I don't mind doing these podcasts, but when it came to reading the book, and it was a time constraint thing too. It was something I could farm out because at that time I was really busy with the Facebook page every day and just couldn't carve out enough time. And what I'm finding now is I'm at the very last couple of chapters or two of my next detective novel, which is going to be titled Atheist Prayer. And it's basically a fictionalized account of if Richard Dawkins or one of his ilk needed a private detective to protect him, my guy would be the guy that they hired because he's not he's a no nonsense guy. And so I think I'm really excited about that, and I think I've got a great hook because the story cycle is that the guy's sidekick tells him that as a joke. The title of the book is actually the punchline of a joke in one of the first chapters. Oh, you're the answer to an atheist prayer. But I can't get the book finished. I'm like a chapter or two away and I'm so close. But I sit down and I write maybe a page or two at the end of the day. And between doing the podcast and the Facebook page and all the other things that I'm doing just in daily life, I get an hour at the most at the end of the day, and I'm usually pretty exhausted when I do it. And just kicking this over to, I've been doing this for 2 or 3 months, just trying to get these last couple of chapters out. And
sometimes
it's like crawling over a bed of nails. I recently just added several people as moderators to the Facebook page to help me with the burden of keeping up with all of the interaction. And so what I'm hoping is that I am going to get to be able to carve at least 2 hours out a day at some point and just knock out those last couple of chapters, because it, to me, it's the next thing on the list is getting that next book out.
Are you under pressure from publisher to get it out?
No.
What if you stop and go on vacation for 2 weeks and don't think about it?
I've done that before.
Did it work?
Yeah. It's actually worked several times. One time I was trying to finish the book Counter Argument for God, and I was having some mental roadblocks, and my wife was actually having what she perceived to be spiritual attacks during the night, where she was waking up feeling like somebody had been trying to choke her to death.
Wow.
And I said, I just need to shut this down and just not work and pray and fast for whatever, 3 days, 5 days, whatever it takes. And at the end of that, within maybe a week, the book was pretty much in the bag and done. So that worked one time. And then another time I was working on a detective novel. It was actually a horror novel. And I went on vacation, and that worked. Was going on vacation, just walking around, relaxing and everything. And you're right. You're exactly right. I'm so caught up with, oh my God, the dogs are barking. I need to go run, let them out real quick. Oh, it's time to feed the dogs. It's time to do this. It's time to do that. And I just need to sit down and focus. And within a day or two, I'd have it knocked out.
Or even your creative process. Sometimes your creative process, if you're calling for it, it won't show up. But if you just let go and don't think about it, then something occurs to you and you're like, oh, that's it. That's what I needed.
No, I'm already past that point.
Oh, really?
I know how the book turns out.
I see.
I know everything. I just have to put it to paper. And I literally, there is some creative angst of you get there and you're ready to start writing, and then you say, okay, now I need to string the words together so that it's coherent and it fits in with the rest of the book and yada yada. And so then you kind of wrestle with the wordsmanship. But other than that, I know who dies. I know how it's all resolved. It's all done.
So then you just need to get it. You just need to get it all down. That's good.
And I can't even get the time to do that where I sit down because I'm making excuses. But at the same time, I'm doing a lot of interesting stuff, like talking with people like you.
Well, thank you. And one more thing I wanted to ask you: have you seen or heard of the movie Nefarious?
I have heard of it. Refresh my memory. What's that about?
I can't pronounce Steve Deace, Deace. You know who that is? He's a Ben Shapiro type.
Okay.
So he wrote this movie called Nefarious. It looks, as you watch it, it looks like a psychological thriller. It's a guy on death row, and the psychologist is coming to interview him on the day of his execution to see if he's fit for execution or not. And so the premise of the movie is that he's an atheist psychologist, mainstream. He knows right and wrong, and he's going to come judge this prisoner.
Oh, he's telling them that he's possessed by demons, isn't he? Yeah.
That's what's really going on. So you walk in, hey, I'm the judge, I'm the arbiter of right and wrong. I'm going to interview you and see if I can help you. And the prisoners, sit down, dude, because you're about to go through a journey. But you're talking about how your wife was going through, wondering if spiritual warfare, that she might enjoy seeing Nefarious because it's about that kind of stuff.
No, you don't know my wife. She wouldn't enjoy that at all.
Okay, then maybe you might.
I would. I really would. And once again, when you bring up one subject, it broaches a new topic that wasn't in my mind previously. And one of the many articles I've written over the years, I did a series called Sympathy for the Devil, taking a play off of the Rolling Stones song. And one of the stories was about this guy who was a rapist and he kidnapped this woman and he raped her for hours in front of her children. He was just a really horrible guy. And I can't remember exactly how he was twisting scripture to justify what he was doing, and he wasn't letting her look at him and this kind of stuff, because if she saw him, he'd have to kill her. And the end resolution of this was that she was an incredibly strong woman, and she said, you know what, I am not going to do anything to give this guy an excuse to kill me. I'm going to survive. My kids need me more than it doesn't matter what happens to my body right now. I need to be there for my kids when this is all said and done. So she endured it. The guy ended up getting caught, and he actually murdered one of his next victims. So he was not just a rapist, he was a murderer as well. And when they caught the guy and investigated him, he had been telling her all these stories about how he'd been abused and he'd grown up as an atheist, or I can't remember all these specific details, but he was giving her just an unstopped barrage of lies. Because in reality, his parents were devout members of a church. I think his father was a pastor, heavily involved in the church, and he had every advantage growing up. He just was evil, and he thrived on being evil, and he took advantage of people. He played off of their biases and prejudices to obscure his identity. But in reality, he was just evil. And I don't really understand how you can grow up in a loving and nurturing environment and you can turn out so wrong. And I guess it's just a symptom of human nature that if you believe in the Bible stories of Cain and Abel, there was no reason for Cain to become a murderer, but he did. Is it human nature that, given the choice between good and evil, we're going to choose evil at least half the time? And I have to say yes, because I know in my own life, I call myself the God conclusion. I mean, that's pretentious in a sense. And so I'm putting myself up on this elevated terrain of saying I'm representative of God in some sense or fashion, but I know my own heart. And I know that I'm capable of evil thoughts. And I know that there's evil in everyone, or the potential for evil in everyone.
Yeah, I think even atheists should probably sign off on that, that there's something about us. And then from our side, if we want to say it's naturalism, we can say that because we're the products of hit and miss, that means that there's some chemicals that are going to push us to do things that other people think is good. And there's chemicals that are going to push us to do the things that people see as bad. So I think atheists and Christians should all say, there's no such thing as you getting to a mindset where you're immune to doing bad things. And so we should always be vigilant against those kind of temptations or those kind of situations.
Agreed. On that note, should we end this for today, or?
Yeah, absolutely. We did, I think, let's look almost an hour and 15 minutes. That's not bad.
It's not bad at all, my friend. I enjoyed it as always. And I guess next time we'll maybe talk about the book.
Yeah, I'd like that. You're a really good storyteller and you're a good author. And Richard Dawkins' book needed addressing. So I'm glad that you took that on.
I'm not the only one, and I'm not sure I was the best to do it, but I felt called to do it. And once I get something in my head, it's hard to get it out.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Have a good day.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.